Hello and welcome to an agile response to COVID. I'm Bob Treblecock. I'm the editorial director of Supply Chain Management Review magazine. And joining me today is Greg Tornman, AGCO's Vice President of Global Materials, Logistics, and Demand Planning. Greg, welcome.
Hello, everyone.
When COVID hit last spring, supply chains around the globe came to a sudden halt. Some organizations were caught flat-footed, others were just slow to react, and still others took steps to address their own operations, but still came up short when their suppliers had to shut down. Then there were companies like AGCO, where Greg works. They're one of the world's largest manufacturers of agricultural equipment. Now, AGCO had systems in place to receive early warning signals that something disruptive was coming its way. And they had processes that allowed the company to take proactive actions to keep operating on a global basis. Today, I think we're calling that agile. Now, a year into the pandemic, Greg and his team are revising those plans and processes based on the lessons they've learned from the pandemic. After all, no one knows where the next disruption will come from, or whether it'll be another virus, an event of nature, or even a political disruption. But we do know it'll come. So over the next 45 minutes, we're going to talk about how AGCO responded to COVID, but also how the manufacturing is positioning its supply chain to be even more effective in the future. So Greg, let's get started. First, tell us briefly about AGCO, what you do, the scope of your supply chain, what's most important to your customers. In other words, what drives your supply chain?
That's a great question, Bob. And what drives our supply chain is our customer requirements. And when you step back and look at those requirements, there's time segments and then there's service segments. Time in a sense of when the seed needs to go into the ground, and service segments based on weather conditions and other activities over the course of the growing season that we may need to be able to support them with. That's what drives us. So in understanding what drives us, we need to understand the limiting factors for us to realize that strategy. So how do we best ensure that our customer chain is protected and ensuring that they can get seed in the ground? That forced us to take a step back in a number of areas to understand what ifs, scenario plannings, and time in a maybe different perspective than we had years ago.
Greg, also within your supply chain, I think another driver, and it's related to what you were talking about, is your aftermarket or your service parts, right? Because it's not just enough to deliver equipment to your customers, but they got to be able to keep it running when they need to put seed in the ground. Can you talk a little bit about your service parts?
Absolutely, Bob. And that's kind of what the variability that happens based on weather conditions and the other impacting factors. So for us, the number one thing in keeping a customer happy is keeping them running when they need to use their equipment, which is very time sensitive. What does that mean for us? That we need to have the right product in the right distribution center that is closest to the customer. In case of need, we can get the product there as fast as possible. I call that kind of our system first fill. So over the course of 2020, we did see some disruptions. And how did we compensate for that? As always, customers first. We would pull product off of assembly line in order to support a customer if they had a need. So from our perspective, during the event, we did what we would normally do, and that's take care of the customer needs first.
And then last along those lines, before we start talking about the pandemic, just give us a little sense of, I know you're a global company, the scope of where you're manufacturing, where you're distributing from, just some things like, 8 factories, 20 countries, just a couple of facts and figures.
Sure. So for us, it starts with the customers mentioned. We have about 4,000 plus dealers across the globe, right? Oh. We have approximately 54 factories across the globe and 36 aftermarket distribution centers located across North America, South America, Europe, Asia, and Australia.
Great. This all started in Wuhan, and if memory is correct, you have operations in Wuhan. So when and how did your team first start hearing about, hey, there's a virus, there's something happening in Wuhan, and we ought to pay attention to this?
Sure. We have some suppliers located in that region. We do not have our own assembly sites located in that province. We're closer to Shanghai area and Shandong. So with that, we started to hear a little bit of it about this in early December, right? I can remember being in Shanghai airport, getting a call from one of my team members saying, "Hey, this is coming up. Okay, let's pick it up. Keep your ear to the grindstone." As things began to develop early in January, things became a little bit more clear. And that time of the year, especially last year when Chinese New Year was, late January, we were going through our normal what ifs and planning to ensure everything was shipped out and everything that was going to be shipped out after the fact was well prepared. So in mid-January, when the Chinese New Year got extended, and then later in January, when the 2-week lockdown was defined by the Chinese government, we started to act, right? What does it mean? First, what does it mean in China for people's safety, which was the number one driving factor in terms of PPE and the right operating environment for them to operate safely. So we took a big stance on that up front to ensure that we, as AGCO, were able to operate, number one, safety for our team members before anything else happened.
Early on there, did you have a sense? One of the things that has kind of surprised me in the months since you and I first talked about this was just talking to friends that work at other large global manufacturing companies, that a number of companies actually did start hearing things, and coming out of Wuhan. I have a friend that works at Eaton Corporation in internal communications, and said that all of a sudden they started hearing in January, hey, something's going on in China. We need to start thinking about this. Did you have a sense of just what the extent of it was going to be, not globally at that point, but what the extent of it was going to be in China?
Sure. So when they extended the Chinese New Year, things are already starting to get noisy, let's put it that way. And at that point in time, we started doing our what ifs and where are we and where the risk's going to be. So we knew when they extended the shutdown period for 2 weeks, where our hot buttons and our priorities would be. On or about the same time when the Chinese government defined the return to work restrictions or requirements, we immediately went to work, again, to ensure the safe startup, but also to ensure the right prioritization of what we focused on in an efficient manner once the restart was allowed to happen on February the 10th.
Did it hit your own Chinese manufacturing operation? Wuhan was suppliers, but
Sure.
did it impact your own manufacturing, and if so, for how long?
Well, originally we had been planned to shut down for Chinese New Year activities for the typical 2 weeks, about 2 weeks. Typically, when we come back, it's a slow startup and it takes about 2 full weeks to get fully recovered. So the activities we planned before the shutdown take that into account. So as China government said, 2 week shutdown for basically everything, we were allowed to start back up on February 10th, provided A, B, C, D, and X were covered from a safety perspective. So we were able to quickly, 1, understand, 2, act, 3, get the safety product into China, and then provide a very, very consistent and efficient prioritization from our global needs to our China team to take effect. It took us about 3 weeks after the startup on February 10th to get back up to what we would call full speed. Some of the challenges that we incurred were the other suppliers across China as they were starting to ramp up. Certain facilities started a little bit slower because they couldn't get their team members back from Chinese New Year, right? They had to go into quarantine. So it was kind of like you normally have this slow ramp up of, for us, 2 weeks that really turned into almost a 6-7 week cycle. But we were efficiently able to manage that in a way that AGCO's priorities, the customer, was at the forefront in driving us efficiently and effectively.
Did those supplier shutdowns, we talked about Wuhan going into your own manufacturing operations in China, but did those parts disruptions impact operations anywhere else, where you might have been getting Chinese parts for operations in Europe or North America or South America?
Sure. Well, as we normally do during the Chinese New Year, we know what the hot parts are when we come back out. So we knew kind of the priority. That allowed us then to attack that efficiently. As China was coming back, it became more challenging to get products to port, right? Just because of the logistics within the provinces and then the shipping, blank sailings, et cetera, didn't have the same level of capacity available. So what our teams were doing in parallel, we're developing solutions by rail going to Europe, developing options by air if it was going to go to South America, or even in some cases, shipping by rail across Asia into Europe, and then by sea from, say, Antwerp down into Sao Paulo. So as the January timeframe is evolving, we start to do scenario planning to understand what ifs and where to. And as a result of that, a lot of the noise and kind of the inefficiencies that typically happen in a crisis were somewhat muted down because we were very well organized in terms of the prioritization that we needed to take in support of the customer.
Now, and I might be jumping ahead because I can't remember the dates, but if I remember correctly, there was a PPE play here that you took action on pretty early, and I can't remember if it was in response to Wuhan or later. But tell us a little bit about how AGCO said, PPE might be important. We're going to get some of that and bring it to one of our other warehouses so we have it. Can you talk about that aspect of it?
Yeah, this was one of the really cool things I'm super, super proud of our organization about. So I think it was around January 29th when the Chinese government defined the February 10th return to work option, right? If A, B, C, D, E, F. And that was kind of the light bulb going off to say, if this is what the Chinese government's defining, and there's going to be a big demand for that within China, we can't take the risk that we won't be able to get that. So the call went out on the 29th to our other regions. And within the following Monday, 83,000 masks were in the air, along with gloves, face shieldings, the gowns. But also, what do we need to do on our manufacturing floor to ensure that the distancing? And that doesn't start on the manufacturing floor. It starts on the bus systems. How and where do you normally get your people into your factories? For us and a lot of companies, it's on the bus. That's where you've got to start, because that's where you've got distancing challenges. Then it gets into lining up to go into the factories, distancing, having your temperature checked, and the other things that we did up to the floor. And we did find in some cases where we had to reduce our tack times in order to space out our operators. We would add another shift, right? Again, safety was first priority. But the AGCO response from outside of China to support our family in China was super strong. Fast forward to, let's call it early March, the reciprocation happened. When Europe couldn't get what they needed, China stepped up like a gorilla.
Yeah, what I'd found interesting about that was that you were responding to the PPE thing at a time when I think most of us in North America couldn't spell PPE and didn't know what it stood for, right? And we're just talking about those shortages. We started thinking about them in April, May, and June time factor. But AGCO had been addressing it then. I want to ask you one last question about China, and then talk a little bit about just the role of risk management before we look at your other operations. So at some point in China, they sort of come out of this. I think this is later in the spring, and you're really ramping up. Talk about how you ramped up and how quickly you got back to full speed in your Chinese operations.
Sure. So on average at that point in time, we were shipping about 75 containers worth of product out of China. Some of that was finished product. Some of that was components going to North America, Europe, and South America. When we came back on February 10th, there were some critical items that needed to ship by the end of that week. The first shipment went out on February the 13th at 11:30 at night, right? Pictures, nobody's happy. Everybody responded to that. That was our first major success. That then built upon a total of 105 containers we were able to start shipping by the week of March 3rd. So that had about a 3-week kind of ramp up plan to where we were able to not only restart, but ramp up to our normal levels and then start to recover some of the past dues that we had to ship, right? And how we were able then recover that from the other end is use things like rail or more direct expedited sea shipments to protect our customer performance requirements.
So this was not just this is a whole supply chain approach, right? It wasn't just your operations inside your facilities, your supplier facilities, but it was also that I don't want to use last mile, but essentially it's all that, trains, boats, and trucks that comes after we make stuff that we often, don't think about. This was an
Sure.
entire effort.
And Bob, for us, it was, what are the options that we have so that when an action happened or an event happened, we already knew. We weren't having then to start investigating and lose 2 or 3 days,
Mhm.
right? We had things planned. What if, ABC option, execute now.
So the fact that you were able to go through this what if scenario says that risk management was an important component of what you do at AGCO. So I'd like you to talk about two things. First, talk about your risk management program, how you've put that in place. And then second, how did you get those warning signals? Because not everybody got them. By having these processes in place, by having a risk management program, you were able to hear, you were able to listen and hear. So what was it?
Sure.
What's risk management at AGCO, and then what tools did you have in place?
So for AGCO, we'll talk a bit about what risk management is. And from our perspective, it's how do you manage time for those events that are going to happen that may or may be inside or outside of your control, Bob. So we go back in time to maybe 2013 and 14 when we identified the need for a what we call a structured, formalized, globally implemented risk management structure. Typically, companies will look at risk as supplier financial stability, right? Well, that's one aspect of it. When you then look at the globalization and other challenges and headwinds that we've been seeing grow over the years, at the time, I should say, we said we need to be prepared to handle geopolitical, weather, labor strikes, and all the other things that happen that, it's just the reality for supply chain professionals. So we hooked up, a set of requirements of what we thought. We talked to people in the industry about what was available, what was happening, what was hype versus what was real, what was valuable versus, maybe not so valuable to organizations. And we came up with a series of things that said, going forward in a digitized globe, we need to understand information faster than what we do today. And as a result, we partnered with a company by the name of Risk Methods. And, we learned a lot. It took a lot of time to be able to get implemented. But what we had put in place and still have today is the ability at the supplier postal code level or zip code to grab social media content, what's happening, and really filter that into the supplier operations, weather conditions, things of that nature, the what ifs, the could be's. And that is your first alert of something that is happening. That first alert is when the clock starts from a time perspective. So for us, we have a very structured and formalized way that the alerts are sent out to the buyer, to the planner, to logistics folks when one of their suppliers is impacted. If you look at what happened in Wuhan, when we first started to hear about this, it was through word of mouth. It wasn't necessarily through the social media. But because our processes focus on is there a risk? How severe is it? Do we need to ignore it? Do we need to monitor it? Or do we need to act? In the case of Wuhan in December, when we heard, it was let's monitor. And then in January, it became more clear that we needed to take action. So how we operate and how we set our requirements up back in 13 and 14 enabled us from a process perspective, from an operating cultural perspective, to dive into that and assess it. And we got it right. So when you then take it to the next level, how are we able then to use that same set of structures and processes to proactively manage time to the best of our ability? So what we were able to do is within our risk methods software package, we were able then to extract data and then compare data to the ppm level of the infection rates by country, by postal code. And within the risk method software, we could see the postal codes where our suppliers were concentrated. That then enabled us to see where the risk of COVID restrictions by government actions, by people, maybe being concerned about going into work, would grow first. That then allowed AGCO to start working with the suppliers to pull in material, to ask the questions that we, were looking for. And as a result of that, we've managed time very, very effectively.
Just out of curiosity, I once did a story with The Gap when their brand new e-commerce distribution center for the upcoming holiday season burned down in August. So not a good thing, right? Just 4 months before Black Friday. And I remember Sean Rollins, their chief supply chain officer, saying to me, well, we had a playbook for that, and we pulled it off the shelf, and we were on the phone, that night, middle of the night, calling people. I just wondered, did you have a pandemic playbook, or was there something in your risk management playbook that would have been addressed the kind of issues you faced here?
And that's a very interesting question. And it's one that I hear from many of the peers that I talk to ongoing, not just in the year, but just ongoing. And for us, the communication between and across our regions to have one team is at the basis, right? We're talking a minimum once a week in terms of the global supply and demand lead. So everybody kind of knows what's going on. Everybody is a customer and supplier to each other. And as a result of that, there's a lot of what I call pride in having the best on-time shipping to the internal region, if you will. That forum in itself allows us to, one, understand the risks that are coming up, the actions that we need to be taking, the prioritization that our teams need to work. And it also then enables us to work very efficiently with our suppliers, right? And oftentimes what we hear from OEMs is they fight each other for the same supply during a critical situation, right? That's the last thing that you want to have, because your organization as well as supplier is negatively impacted at one of the most critical times. So for us, when you've got 50 plus plants and your aftermarket requirements prioritized and fully aligned, and having one person coordinate that with the supplier, it's much more efficient from the supplier's end as well as our end. And what we found with that network, that we were very effective in not necessarily having a 75 point playbook, but rather we had the organized and aligned operating execution plan that was very, very efficient. From there, the playbook in terms of how you return to work, how the questions go, sure, that stuff's all documented. But the what ifs, those things that you never planned for, you may not have in your playbook. So then you're down to your people. And how effective are your people at effectively working together to efficiently develop and execute a recovery plan?
Before we talk about how COVID spread across other operations, you just hit on something I think pretty important, maybe to explore a little bit more when we're talking about risk management and what you did between 2013 and 2020. When we talk about S&OP, people always say, well, it's people, process, and technology, and people's probably more important than technology is 10%. So if you think about developing a best practice for risk management, the people part of it, how do you put a risk management team together, and how do you empower that team?
And that's a very interesting question, because what is risk, right? Risk is up to us as human beings to assess. You may view something more risky than what I would, or vice versa on a different topic. So again, it goes back to the culture of time. So if you get an alert, then you definitely need to give that alert some attention. And what we're able to do is follow those alerts by planners and basically see when were they acted upon, were they, ignored, if you will, you close it off, it's not that big a deal. Or is it severe? And if it's severe, we need to monitor it till closure, right? And if you think about a closed loop system, corrective action, whatever you want to call it, you've got your initial action, call it kind of your spill or containment. From there, it goes into, kind of the next set of stages of recovery. But the most important part is the 30, 60, 90 follow-up to ensure that the actions you took delivered the intended response and non-reoccurrence of that issue. The same thing happens with how we manage our risk management. The same thing happens how we manage our supplier performance, right? If there is an issue, we want to bring it full closure. So as we were rolling those programs out, we're monitoring this. we're asking our team members at the tactical execution level, how is this working? What could work better? And we acted on that. So as we're able to, take not just the initial implementation functionality, but the learning from the people that are using the tools to develop another tool, the people have a lot of pride in that because they had input to how that future process series and steps would be operating. That pride is what holds things together, right? During times like this, because there's always going to be some bumps along the way. So how do you best solve it? With people that are committed to solving the problems.
Is in putting a risk management team together, one, is it a formal team, and is it cross-functional? And are there skill sets, and let's say it's cross-functional and you're looking for somebody from logistics, for instance, somebody from procurement. Are there skill sets that you look for or that you think are valuable to creating a risk management team?
So it's definitely cross-functional, right? And I think, and it's not a standard way of working, right? I think if something happens, you may need to take an action that requires more financial involvement. And the COVID example was there. There was a lot of concern of what would happen with our tier 1, tier 2, tier 3s post-COVID or even during COVID. Would they be able to financially survive? So we did a lot of things with our risk methods information, right, from a D&B and other sources of information. And where we saw some level of risk, we brought in our financial team members to talk with the suppliers, right, to understand much more accurately what's actually happening with cash, what's actually happening with their ability to operate. And again, what are you trying to do? Manage time more effectively. In other aspects, you could say, okay, I've got a supplier that has some type of financial risk, right? Maybe it's a medium risk. Well, in our new sourcing process, we would take a look at those recommended suppliers. And if there was one of those suppliers that could have some level of risk, there'd be more engagement up front in the sourcing process to validate, is that the right decision, right? So that's one of the ways that we use our risk management approach to proactively prevent some risk from coming into the system, right? And it works pretty well.
Yeah. So it sounds like part of PPE might have been, helping with cash flow and things of that, not just masks and whatever, but keeping people safe and operating. Sounds like there was also a financial component as part of that. One last question, and then we're going to come back to the pandemic for a moment. We talked about people. You talked a lot about processes, so I'm not going to bring you back to that. On the technology, along with risk methods, or does risk methods tie into your other systems? How does the technology piece of that work?
So we have a kind of a core system we call Apex, and that's our kind of go-to place in communication with suppliers on a number of things. But it integrates things like how are the suppliers doing performance-wise, whether it's quality, engineering, NPI, logistics, delivery, whatever it might be. Then you've got the risk management piece that comes in on top of that. And then some other factors that come in from an engineering perspective that kind of makes what we call our Apex dashboard. That is one globally standardized system that is at a profile level and language of the user, right? So it's user friendly. And within that, that's kind of our go-to place for information. So as I mentioned earlier on some of the sourcing decisions, we can do extracts out of Apex that allows us to see the risk, the performance, the development activities for any point in time. And for us, we typically on a monthly basis look at the results from the previous month. The suppliers have the ability to sign into Apex to see how they're performing. They use Apex for all of their PPAP and ISR submissions, right? So it's bi-directional. With that, if they want to question some of the performance ratings that we've given to them, they have the option to inquire with us formally with a date stamp. We commit to give them a response in X number of days, and we follow up on that response internally the same way we would follow up with a supplier on their on-time shipping preparations. Why? Because we believe that the commitment that we ask for from the supplier should be the same thing that they ask from us, right? So that Apex kind of cornerstone is very, very important for us in terms of a central place of information, globally standardized, globally transparent, and bi-directional with suppliers.
Interesting. So, do you have a supplier council? Some of the automakers have a supplier council that it's a formal organization that meets and whatever, and responds back to to Ford, GM, whomever. I know I did one with Raytheon on how they created a supplier council to give them feedback on how they're doing as a customer.
That for us is a differentiator, right? Because we are not the largest in what we do, which means we may not have the full amount of leverage. That then drives us to become a customer of choice. Okay. That customer of choice kind of, focus area is something we developed back in 12 and 13, actually. So as we were going forward with the different type of enhancements, whether it's process functionality, we would be reaching out to suppliers, getting their input. Step one. Step two, to your real question, I believe, on the Supplier Council, in each of our regions, we basically have what we call a set of partner or VIP suppliers. Typically on a twice a year basis, we're bringing them together, kind of a bi-directional information sharing. How are we doing? What's going on? What do we need to do? Here's what we're seeing happening. Here are the areas that we see going into over the next several years. And with that, it's not just here's what we're going to do. It's here's what our plans. What can we do to make this more effective for us as a whole, right? And the results of that are pretty positive, right? And we see that in the implementation of some of the programs. I think I had shared in the past with you when we rolled out our global TMS, right? That's a pretty big change for suppliers when they're having to go in and change how they're entering the information. But if you go back to 2013, you could have a supplier in Germany shipping to 8 different AGCO factories. They'd have 8 different processes, 8 different ways of doing that. So when we went forward with our new TMS, that became one. So the suppliers really loved it. So out of the 1,500 suppliers that we had to implement with in Europe, we only had 2 with pushback, right? That for us was verification that we are hearing and working with our suppliers on our common path forward to enable an efficient and effective supply chain.
So it sounds like, I'm going to come back to COVID now. And it sounds like a lot of things we just talked about laid the foundation for being able to listen, hearing that something's going on, and then react with your suppliers. So one of the things that struck me when the first time we talked about this is that you had either the good fortune or the bad luck to operate every bad place in the world. So you learn a lot from Wuhan, and then the virus moves to northern Italy, and you had operations or suppliers or both in that area. It goes into Brazil, and you operate in South America. So as the pandemic, became a global event, what did you learn from Wuhan, and then how did you implement that, for instance, in northern Italy, in Brazil, or wherever else you were doing business?
Okay. So the first question we always ask is, what's next? What could happen, right? Kind of the lessons learned. Part of that recovery to building a better mousetrap for the future. So for us, after Wuhan or China, it was South Korea and Japan. And that's where we developed kind of this PPM kind of growth rate together with our risk methods information to be able to predict what's going to happen. So we took that, basis of what can we do better? Okay, let's take a look at within Asia where the COVID counts are growing and what can we start to do? So we started to gain a little bit of traction there. When we then went into Europe, we were able to use those same tools in northern Italy to start pulling in material. I think it was about 7 business days before the government restrictions started to go into place. And 7 working days in our operating environment is a ton of time when no one else is acting, right? So as we're getting product out, in shipments, we're not having to fight with X number of other customers trying to pull product out of that same supplier or same area. So we kind of got a head start. As a result of that, we then continued to look across Europe, and we're able then to take the same proactive steps for Spain, for Switzerland, and Sweden. I don't know why it was the S's, but it was the S's. And within that, it was quite powerful because suppliers were asking the question, why are you doing this? Well, we just want to make sure that we get our product on time. We might have to increase a little bit of volume because we didn't want to distract things. We wanted them focused on AGCO products, and I can tell you that. And after we ran into the shutdown periods in late, let's call it April, late March, we then went into the what's next, right? So where the suppliers are in the highest risk zones, what is high risk? Where do we have the most amount of challenge or hospitalization? That in itself would cause the lockdowns to continue on longer. So we immediately then started to look for other sources of supply around the world based on the criticality of that supplier's operating region. We then propagated the same approach in South America and in North America with great results. But it wasn't just the risk management element, right? More importantly than that was a safety protocol that our teams on the manufacturing floor coming into the office. And what we could do when we started, to implement it on the floor on February 10th is we had about a month's time to prepare in Europe, right? China, how are you doing it? Let's see it on the floor. Let's see pictures, things that we internally could share as best practice, right? That to me, Bob, was even more efficient or effective than how we manage the suppliers. Why? Because our people were at the core of what we were trying to take care of.
Given that there was a lot of regulation around this and government shutdowns, based on what you learned about how to operate safely in China, were you able to work with governments wherever else you were operating to continue by demonstrating that you had best practices in place and could operate safely?
Absolutely. And we saw that very, very strongly in Northern Italy, right? As we are, in the food chain, we were able to operate under essential industry. Two things happened there. One, we were able to work with our legal teams to get the right legal documentation in the supplier's hands that they would be able to show then to their local government requirements, right? So that would be, call it one step of that. The second piece of that was going to be how and when those suppliers would be able to come back, right? If I missed it, maybe I didn't answer it.
No. Another part of that in keeping your suppliers going was that you had sourced PPE early on and had PPE that you could distribute, not just your own operations, but to suppliers. So tell me how that worked and the relationship you had with suppliers around PPE.
And that's one I probably should have brought up earlier from the lessons learned, because as China went back to work, what we found was the suppliers were not as ready as we were. And we planned on that. When we initially, that 83,000 masks, that would have covered our needs as well as our tier one suppliers for 6 weeks, right? So as we were talking with suppliers, we developed a script. Part of that script was, how much PPE do you have? How much, do you have access to it? So as we were amassing our global needs, we were bringing into account what our suppliers' needs were for that particular critical commodity. And as a result of that, we're able to help them. Now, in a couple of cases, particularly in South America and North America, we had cases where the suppliers could not restart. They had zero PPE. They were not ready. Okay, that's fine. Here it is. And they would be able to get their people into the plants typically within 1 to 2 days and start making AGCO components for our factories.
Great. We're a year into this. If you look back at how you operated, I'm sure you had some disruptions, but through this whole thing, were you able to operate at 90%, 90, overall? What were the biggest disruptions that you experienced? And how much or how little did it slow down your overall ability to meet your customer needs?
So I would say China, hard shutdown for the 2 weeks and then the re-ramp up. We were able to recover that pretty quickly. When I say pretty quickly, I think it was March 30th. So by the end of the Q1, we were able to satisfy shipping all of the customer tractor and combine requirements out of that region. We then look at Europe. It was a bit more difficult, right? The shutdown period lasted longer amount of time, I think about 4 to 5 weeks, driven by government restriction, not because of our ability to supply. So with that, as we put together our, we call recovery plans or scenarios, we had like 4 different scenarios. And what we found was that we were able to increase our build plans in our factories, adding a second shift or whatever it might be, in order to recover that lost volume that we had in the late March and April timeframe in Europe, and did a very, very good job. Part of that recovery was also looking across the dealer network. One of the objectives that we had that year was to reduce the amount of inventory we had out in the field. So we kind of got a little bit lucky in a sense that we wanted to take down some of the finished goods inventory in our dealer network. We lost about a month's worth of production. So it became very clear, okay, we focus on the retail orders, and maybe some of that other stuff we don't need to fully recover. When you then look in South America, it actually hit us pretty hard, but we got actually hurt harder later in the year in Q4 because of the aftermath of the virus impact to the region. There just really wasn't enough raw material in the region because the steel mills shut down, right? They were thinking automotive plants are shutting down. They don't need to produce. Well, the, kind of the whipsaw effect of that didn't come up until Q4. And it's a challenge still. North America in itself, our factories never stopped.
In the time we have left, I think we probably have about 10 minutes left. We're now moving to the next stage. My theory is that if people haven't figured out how to work through the pandemic, they're probably going to, right? And you've had a year of working with this. So now you're thinking about, so what did we learn from this? How do we move our operations forward? I'd like to take you sort of in the little time we have left through just some of the major processes that we all operate in our supply chains from what you learned. So one, have you rethought the way you work with your supply base, particularly not necessarily your tier ones, but the tier twos and tier threes who make sure the tier ones can work with you? Are you monitoring them differently?
That's something that's on our radar, something that we feel we need to do a much better job at. And we've already started investigating the different options, but we're at a point now where we know what we have from a risk management policy. So now we're asking our teams, what do we need to do? Included in that is the tier 2 and 3 and 4. Our estimates are that we've got about 125,000 suppliers involved in our extended supply chain when we go down to a tier 4. So your ability as an OEM to quickly get a hold of 125,000 suppliers and get them to open up everything and participate probably is not a 6-month type of deal. So what our focus is going to be is to kind of segment that risk into to the level of product complexity that we're able to get. So if we buy, for instance, an axle that we may buy from an axle OEM, they may have 12 or 15 or 50 different suppliers versus a plastic, molding piece that has one supplier, meaning that the sheet plastic going into the molder than to us. The axle is going to be a higher priority versus the plastic piece. And as a result of that, we will focus on developing that tier 2, 3, and 4 depth awareness there first, right? The other pieces of that, Bob, are going to be working with the suppliers to get them to open that up, right?
The two concepts we hear a lot are China plus one, rethinking where we source, and moving from just in time to just in case in terms of how much inventory we're stocking. Are you thinking about either of those strategies? And if so, how are you putting them in place?
So on the shorter term piece, in terms of the stocking levels, absolutely. We increased our safety stock levels and we took down our finished good levels, right? So during this process, we saw the opportunity to do a number of things to help improve our working capital, but at the same time, take decisions that would enable us to have a stronger level of confidence that we would be able to execute our build plans because we didn't have to worry about the COVID impact. Now, when I say worry about COVID impact, not necessarily from a mass government shutdown perspective, but rather from a supplier that would have an employee test positive, they would have to do the contact tracing, maybe shut down 1 or 2 days, and subsequently you lose your supply for 3 days out of that. So the safety stock increase we put in place helped us cover that. The bigger picture question in terms of where do you source, how many suppliers, really the business continuity type of topic, that's a major change for us, right? Away from, okay, it's going to cost X $100,000 to dual source this product to it's going to cost me X millions of dollars if I can't run my factory and support my customer on time. So the perspective, I think, has changed in a sense to one that is maybe the JIT thing is a little bit tight, especially this type of situation. But realistically, how is it that we want to structure going forward? We want to have flexibility in two ways, right? One, multiple sources. Why? You can work exchange rate, you can work capacity, you can work a lot of different things with multiple suppliers. It really comes down to how critical is the component or subassembly, and can we operate our business in one way or another? If the answer is no, then dual sourcing, ideally on different areas, is probably the way that we're going to go. And how we do our sourcing is much more detailed now with those business continuity plans.
Two last questions. And the first, a lot of what we talked about had to do with, supply and suppliers, but you touched a little bit on the impact on the transportation component, the warehousing component of COVID. And I just wondered, as a result of this, are you rethinking either your transportation strategies or your warehousing and distribution strategies?
Our transportation strategy, in my view, the structure itself responded wonderfully, right? I couldn't be more proud of the team and our partners in that Foreflow with that piece. Where we ran into the challenges was with, like a lot of people, on the international shipping, right? I mean, we have never seen anything like this. So I wouldn't say that we're doing anything different. We still maintain the options as we did early on, and the ability to watch things from the point of origination to the point of destination in a very effective manner, and managing the performance across that. That's not new. Those are things we've been doing for years, which we believe helped us during that time.
Last question. Supply chains are operated by people. And you go to any supply chain conference, whether you're talking shop floor or top floor with data analysts and things like that, people is the number one issue I hear from supply chain managers. I can't get what I need. And I wondered if, having gone through COVID, and maybe you were thinking this a little bit, but as you think about your supply chain going forward, are the skills that you're going to be looking for, or the skills that you think are going to be required in supply chain management going forward, how are they going to change? What are you looking for differently today versus what you might have looked at 4 or 5 years ago?
Evolving, right? Adaptable are the things that we typically would respond with those type of questions, right? We need problem solvers, people that can work with data from a data analytics, people that can work with a supplier and sell why AGCO product should be produced, people that understand things happen, and that if things don't happen exactly the way the process is laid out, they don't just stop. Entrepreneur, figure it out, fix it, whatever you need to do. And really at the heart of it, people that are focused on winning, right? The glass is half full, we'll figure out how to fill it the rest of the way. If you come to work with that positive can-do attitude, what we find is you're able to produce, you're able to enjoy what you do, have some fun at work, but feel good about who you work for. And when you're in the food chain, people feel good about that, right? The fact that we have a significantly reduced amount of world famine now than what we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, people feel good about that. And they like working in that kind of industry. And for us, we're looking for those people that are problem solvers, that can figure it out, that are positive in nature, but at the end of the day, are adaptable to change of the business needs.
Okay. Greg, thank you. And again, congratulations. I think AGCO really has a great story to tell in terms of how you got through COVID, but I think more importantly, everything that you did from that 2013 period to 2020 that prepared you for this. So great story. Again, thanks for sharing it with us today.
Thanks, Bob. We're looking forward to the next 5 to 7 years to do even more amazing things.